Hi, Steve Mera here, and I want to start by saying Happy Halloween. For me, though, Halloween is really not much like any other day. It's also been something I've avoided over the years because people often contact me and say, will I do things on Halloween? And for me, it's never really any different than any other day, be honest with you, though that there's supposed to be a thinning of the veil between us and the spirit world on Halloween, but Halloween has different time zones around the world, so it lasts for 24 hours accordingly to what people say, but I don't know. What I can say is that I very rarely do investigations or things like that on Halloween, just for the principle of it, really. But nonetheless, it's rich in history. And it goes back for many, many years. But I did do an investigation once, back in 1997, going back some time, in North Wales, which kind of went through the period of Halloween, which was interesting. And it's probably one of the most scariest investigations or things I've ever experienced, to be honest with you, which was terrifying. I'll be honest with you, it was. But I'm going to let you know a little bit about that case as it happened and what took place and its lasting impression on me, should we say. So please, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, share and subscribe, give it a thumbs up. It's really needed for this channel. Seems that we cover so many topics that the platform seems to hate, but hey, that comes with the territory, guys. A big shout out for all those people that have provided help and assistance throughout this year, giving hypes, because these people are hyping videos, and I didn't even know what that meant initially, but I'm a bit old school. But it's a big thank you for any of that assistance, people that have even donated £2 and this, that and the other just towards the channel. It all helps, all goes back into the channel with the research and the equipment and things that we got to buy and places we got to go and do investigations at. So it all helps, it does support. But it's, like I say, it's never ever expected. So big thank you to everybody. It does support us. So please don't forget to like, share and subscribe and enjoy the video. Oh, and happy Halloween. In October of 1997, I was contacted by a fellow investigator who told me about an incident he had read in a newspaper passed to him by his father, who at the time was living in North Wales. The article talked of a family that was living in a large farmhouse that claimed to have the devil in their home. Of course, this was a tabloid headline, and you know what that can be like. However, I was curious and contacted the newspaper reporter, who in turn gave the family my contact details. A couple of days later, I was contacted by the owner, Paul Hastings, who asked if I could assist them. I arranged a preliminary investigation and visited the Hastings at their farmhouse a few days later. On arriving, I was met with smiles and a cup of tea. Then I settled down to interview them. Now, Julie and Paul Hastings and their two children, Bradley and Michael, had recently moved into the farmhouse on March the 26th of that same year. They had been looking for a new home for around 6 months and were surprised to find a large farmhouse at a reasonable price. They had put aside $46,000, and with a loan, they knew they could afford to look for property in the area up to $160,000. But when they found the farmhouse up for sale for as little as $120,250, they jumped at the offer. Julie had instantly fallen in love with the old farmhouse, but Paul was a little more cautious, presuming there may have been a considerable amount of work to be required. However, on inspection, they found that the farmhouse actually needed very little work, and being currently empty, they could move in rather quickly. This suited Paul, as he was desperate to move closer to his parents, as his mother had fallen ill a number of months back, and he was having to take regular trips from Birmingham to North Wales to help out his father. It was agreed, papers were signed, and Julie and Paul and their two children moved into the farmhouse. Now, the previous owners, the Mellors, had only lived in the farmhouse for 8 months before moving out. Previous to that, the farmhouse was owned by a widower by the name of Mr. Robert Williams, who had passed away whilst in hospital at the age of 76. He had apparently been ill for a number of years, suffering from breathing difficulties, and eventually died of pneumonia in November of 1994. On that afternoon of March the 26th, Paul and Julie arrived at the farmhouse. They had left their 2 children with Julie's sister for a few days until they had gotten sorted out and furniture in. Just a few hours later, Paul was finishing putting the last of the furniture upstairs when Julie shouted up to him to come down for a cup of tea. As they sat in the kitchen, a sudden crash came from upstairs. Paul ran up to the bedroom with Julie close behind. He swung the door open and was shocked to see the bedroom cupboard flat on the floor. It had somehow fallen over. Paul looked around but could not find a reason why the cupboard had fallen, the first of many they were to experience in the days to come. The following day, Julie purchased some paint from the local store and set her stripping old wallpaper off the walls in the living room. Paul was laying a carpet in the children's room when he heard Julie shouting him from the bottom of the stairs. Paul came down to find Julie in a bit of a tizzy. She turned to Paul and said, "The strangest thing has just happened. I was stripping the paper off when I heard someone in the kitchen. Thinking it was you, I shouted out to you, but then I realised that you were upstairs. I was sure I could hear you in the kitchen opening and closing cupboards." Paul looked around the kitchen, but nothing seemed out of place. He dismissed the incident, thinking Julie was over-exaggerating, and went back to carpet laying upstairs. It was now March the 30th, and Julie had arrived at the farmhouse around 6:30 p.m. with Bradley and Michael. She had been and picked the 2 boys up from her sister's house and was excited at the thought of showing them their new home. As she pulled up the drive, she immediately noticed that the front door was wide open. She glanced around, expecting to see Paul's van, but it wasn't there. A cold shiver went down her back at the thought of an awaiting burglar, but Julie had grown up in Birmingham and was hardened to such confrontations. She told her 2 boys to remain in the car as she got out and walked towards the farmhouse. She peered into the hallway and shouted out, "Hello!" She waited for a response, but there was nothing but silence. She walked in further and could not find anything out of place. After a thorough check around, she was pleased to conclude that there had not been any break-in. Maybe Paul had somehow forgotten to close the front door before going out, she thought. She went back to the car and took the 2 boys inside to show them the new home. An hour or so later, Paul had arrived home and Julie confronted him about the front door being open, but Paul was adamant that he had not only closed the front door but also double locked it. The couple was so convinced that someone must have been inside their home that Paul telephoned the estate agent they had dealt with and asked if anyone may have had a set of spare keys to the property. The answer was no. On April the 3rd, Julie was woken around 3:20 a.m. She could clearly hear Bradley crying out. She nudged Paul and told him as she made her way to the boy's bedroom. Bradley was sitting up in bed screaming out that a monster was in his room, pointing over to the dark corner of the bedroom. Julie leaned over and switched on the bedside lamp. Bradley had certainly worked himself up. Julie felt Bradley's head and it seemed a little hot. Fearing that he was coming down with something, she decided to go downstairs and get him some medicine. She flicked on the upstairs landing light and walked downstairs to the kitchen. As she turned the corner and entered the kitchen, she suddenly froze. There, in front of her, was a huge, dark figure. For just a few seconds, Julie was so scared she couldn't move. Totally and utter panic came over her as she screamed out and ran for the staircase. Falling clumsily up the stairs in sheer terror that she may be being pursued, she let out yet another scream. By this time, Paul was shocked from sleep. Up and at the top of the stairs, Julie grabbed Paul, jumping up and down, screaming to him, "Someone's in the kitchen! Someone's in the kitchen!" Paul pushed Julie behind him and headed gingerly down the staircase. He stopped outside the kitchen and could hear nothing. He slowly put his hand into the darkness and switched on the kitchen light. Paul jumped through the doorway expecting some type of confrontation, but to his surprise, no one was there. On inspection, all the doors and windows were shut and locked. It was at this very point that Paul had considered the existence of the paranormal for the first time in his life. Julie was still hysterical, crying, Paul eventually calmed her down and asked her to describe what she had seen. Julie said, "Well, I went into the kitchen and I saw this figure stood right in front of me. It was huge. It must have been at least 7 foot tall, all black, and with some type of hood over its head, like what monks wear. It was horrible. I didn't see it move. It just stood looking at me, but I couldn't see a face." Both of them sat in bed talking about what had happened for a good hour or so. Both agreed not to talk about it in front of the kids. It was bad enough that Bradley had started having bad dreams. Julie considered the possibility that Bradley may have seen something unusual as well in his room, but tried to convince herself it was just a childhood dream. Over the next few days, both Julie and Paul had become unsettled and feared a second encounter. On April the 8th, Julie's sister Amanda was visiting and helping Julie decorate the boys' bedroom. They had painted the whole room and put new curtains up. It had taken them most of the day, and when they had finally finished, they shut the door and went downstairs for some tea. Paul soon came in with the boys from visiting his parents. Julie and Amanda took the boys upstairs to show them their newly decorated room. They swung the bedroom door open and stood there in shock. The whole bedroom had been trashed. The curtains had been ripped from their track and were now lying on the floor. The bedding was screwed up in a bundle in the corner of the room. The boys' toys had been thrown around the room. A wall poster had been torn down and was now lying on Bradley's bed, and the 5-drawer unit was on its side, with every drawer out and empty of its contents. There were clothes scattered all over the room. There were also 2 strange marks on the ceilings that, on close inspection, looked to be handprints, some sort of long bony handprints. Julie couldn't believe it. They had not heard any noise whatsoever. All Amanda could do was stand there, say, "Oh my God, oh my God." Julie freaked out and screamed for Paul to come upstairs. He rushed up, also to be met with the same sight. "What the hell happened?" Paul said. Julie explained that something had wrecked the boys' bedroom, and yet she and her sister had heard absolutely nothing. Amanda looked across to Julie and said, "You can't live here. Something evil is in this house. You have to move." Julie, now completely forgetting not to mention anything in front of the boys, burst out crying and told Paul that she couldn't live there and that it wasn't safe. The rest of the night consisted of tidying up the boys' bedroom in hope that the bedroom assault would not occur a second time. The boys were put to bed and their bedroom door was held open by a box of toys for the evening, just in case. Julie got very little sleep that night, as you can well imagine. The following day, Amanda left for home, telling her sister that she needed to get a priest in. Julie agreed and told Paul to make some inquiries. Paul took a couple of photographs of the mysterious handprints before painting over them in hope of showing a priest what they had found. It was now April the 14th. Paul had no luck in convincing a priest to call round to the house. He had made 2 phone calls to the local churches, both of which would not assist. He was told on both occasions that this was not something they deal with. Both Paul and Julie didn't know what to do. It was around 7:30 p.m. Paul was bathing Michael and Bradley was playing in his bedroom. Then all of a sudden, there was a tremendous scream from the boys' bedroom. Paul quickly grabbed Michael out of the bath and ran to the bedroom, closely followed by Julie, who had heard Bradley scream out from downstairs. They rushed in expecting the bedroom to be wrecked again, but no. Bradley was standing there crying and pointing towards the window. "It's there, it's there," Bradley screamed. Neither Paul nor Julie could see anything. "What was it? What was it?" asked Julie. "The monster was at the window," screamed Bradley. Paul rushed to the window but could see nothing. "Where?" Paul shouted. "It was there," Bradley pointed to the window. Paul couldn't see anyone around. Then it dawned on him. If Bradley had seen a face at the window, then the person would have had to have been at least 18 foot tall, as the boys' bedroom window could not be reached from outside unless standing on ladders or something. Paul looked over to Julie and shook his head, indicating that nothing was there. "Must have been a bird or a squirrel," Paul said. Julie calmed Bradley down before getting him ready for bed. They both talked that evening about Bradley, and they both agreed that it must have been in his imagination, and they decided to be more cautious as to what they were saying around the children. April the 19th, Peter arrived home after work around 7:20 p.m. to find Julie in a right mess. She was crying and shaking like a leaf. "What's wrong? What happened?" Paul asked. Julie explained she was cooking tea for the boys whilst they were playing in the living room when suddenly something grabbed her from behind. It felt like a large hand around her throat for just a few seconds, long enough for Julie to start panicking, of course. Just as she was to raise her hands to her throat, whatever it was let go. Julie turned round. There was no one there. She reached out for a knife off the worktop and held it out in front of her. As she stood there trembling, she heard the most unearthly growl come from the corner of the kitchen. Julie screamed and ran. She flew into the living room, grabbed the boys and shot out the front door. She sat crying in the backyard for at least an hour before being forced to have to go back into the kitchen to turn off a cooking chicken which she had left in the oven. She then sat in the living room waiting for Paul to arrive home. This was the turning point in the experiences. From that day on, the disturbances increased in frequency and severity. As the days passed, frequent and horrific sounds would come from the walls, the ceilings. Sounds of pigs snorting and often accompanied by growls. Terrible odours would suddenly fill the rooms. Rotten meat was regularly smelled in the living room and the bedrooms. Strange sounds would often be heard coming from seemingly empty rooms, such as footsteps, whispers and even humming. By this time, Julie had moved out with the two boys and had gone to stay at her sister's, leaving Paul to sort out the house. Over the following weeks, Paul visited several churches and rang a couple of establishments that helped with such disturbances. However, they did not even visit the farmhouse. Out of sheer desperation, Paul eventually reached out to the local press to see if someone could help. They ran a small article which was later picked up by another prominent newspaper, which led to a reporter sharing my information with Paul. October the 13th, I pulled up the drive and I could see Paul standing by the side of his van. I had taken along a fellow investigator, Darren Hurst, and an assortment of electronic equipment in the hope of finding some evidence of what Paul had been saying. As I shook Paul's hand, I could see he was a little worse for wear. I learnt that 2 days before my visit, a vicar from a local church had decided to call and see Paul after he had received several telephone messages asking him for help. He talked with Paul briefly and conducted a blessing in each of the rooms. But as the vicar was reading from his Bible, he seemed to become a little light-headed and ended up having to place his hand on the banister. Paul decided to go downstairs to the kitchen and get a glass of water for the vicar. By the time he had filled the glass and walked to the kitchen doorway, the vicar was already in the downstairs hallway. Paul passed the glass of water to the vicar, who quickly drank it down, thanked Paul and departed in pace, only muttering the words, "I hope I've been some assistance." Paul stood at his front door with a puzzled face as he watched the vicar sped away quickly in his car. Something had seemingly spooked him. Paul was convinced of it. That very same night, Paul found himself on the verge of leaving his home for good. It was not until around 3 a.m. that all hell broke loose. Paul was woken from sleep by what only can be described as an earthquake. He shot up in bed and looked around. Everything was shaking. The bed, the wardrobe, the cupboards, and even a picture on the wall. Then came the sudden sound of things smashing and banging around downstairs. Paul jumped up from his bed and headed to the hallway. As he passed the boy's bedroom, he suddenly came to an abrupt halt. Looking in, he could see bedclothes being thrown around the room, toys and games falling from the shelves. Then the boy's cupboard suddenly lunged forward, tipping and crashed to the ground. In anger, Paul rushed in, screaming out, "Stop it, leave us alone!" He grabbed the cupboard and lifted it up. As he turned, he was just about to shout out again. He caught sight of something. He stood there, transfixed, at an image in the window. Paul had never felt so scared, physically shaking. He described the image to me. He said, "I turned on the light and then I saw it just for a minute. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The bedroom window reflected an image. It was very clear. The only way I can describe it, and this is going to sound stupid, but to me, it looked like the devil. I could only see the head and shoulders. It had long drawn face. glowing orange eyes, and what looked to be ram-type horns protruding from its head. It just looked right at me. That was it. I was out of there. Enough is enough. I grabbed my clothes, car keys, and got out of there. I don't believe in things like this, but when you see something like that, then it's hard to dismiss. No way was I staying in that house. Paul had driven up from Julie's sisters the following morning to meet us. He explained that he had gone into the house about an hour before I had arrived and cleaned up a bit, but he was still a bit unnerved. Julie won't come anywhere near the place now, he said. During the interview with Paul, he described an incident that took place a few months back. Paul had a games room situated at the top of the stairs. The room was approximately 12 by 14 feet, and when Paul first set eyes on it, he immediately thought it would make a great games room for the boys. He decorated it, put up shelving, and purchased a pool table. It was delivered and installed. On one occasion, Paul went to go into the games room and found that the door would only open about an inch. He pushed hard and found that he couldn't open the door. The following day, Paul popped in at dinner time with his co-worker Mike, and it took several attempts at pushing and ramming the door to slowly get it to open. To their amazement, the pool table had been pushed up against the door from inside the room. Now, the strangest thing was that the games room only had one door to get in and out of, and no windows. The act of moving this heavy pool table had to have been paranormal in nature. After he told me this, I went looking around the property. Did Paul really see something resembling a devil, or was it his imagination getting the better of him? I recall that one of Paul's sons also claimed to have seen something in the bedroom window. The house seemed calm though, but there was certainly an electrical charge in the air. EMF readings around the house was around a steady 8 milligauss, which was just a little high. Temperatures also seemed normal. About 45 minutes into my investigation, I suddenly heard Darren shout out for me. I ran into the living room and saw Darren pointing towards the table. The notes of paperwork I had left there were on fire, and Darren was attempting to put them out. How had they caught fire? Paul was outside loading his van with items. We quickly put them out. I couldn't find no explanation as to how the paperwork became burnt and singed. A mystery I was never to explain. Further investigations in the house didn't really find much. I went outside to the back garden for a look around. At first, it just looked like another normal garden. Okay, it was a bit overgrown, but then something caught my eye. An unusual rock up in the top corner of the garden, partly covered by a large shrub. I moved the shrub aside to reveal a large stone with, wait for it, with a pentagram symbol on top of it. It seemed to be etched into the stone and overlaid with possible charcoal. I found 3 such stones in the back garden, which Paul and Julie had missed. A strong possibility that someone may be messing around with things they shouldn't have. Could this be a catalyst for such diabolical hauntings? I have to admit, I was certainly a little bit anxious. Maybe something was really going on. On showing Paul the markings in the stones, he was rather upset, as well as annoyed. Annoyed that he had not spotted them. We sat in the kitchen having a large cup of coffee. As I discussed our return to the location, I was clearly going to need more equipment, maybe such as CCTV and other monitoring devices. I arranged to return on October the 22nd, to which Paul seemed happy about. I recall my conversation with Darren on my way home. Something had certainly been going on. Paul looked traumatized. And how the hell did our paperwork suddenly and inexplicably catch fire? I arrived back on October the 22nd on my own though. Darren could not attend due to other commitments. I had been told by Paul that no one would be in the farmhouse and that the key had been left in a hidden place so that I could let myself in and lock up afterwards. To be honest, I was a little on pins being on my own, knowing something rather nasty might be in the home. I entered the property immediately, turning on the lights. I'm not daft, you know. Working around the farmhouse, everything seemed fine. That is, until I got to the upstairs bedrooms. A potent odour of rotten meat filled the air. A sickly smell. Horrible. For me, this was unnerving. Was it a precursor for something worse to happen? At that point, a cold feeling of dread came over me, literally. I've experienced this before though. I looked down and I could see the goosebumps forming on my arms and the hairs standing up. It was as if the environment had suddenly become charged. There was no way I was staying to temporarily install CCTV camera monitoring systems, even though they would have only been in the home for operating for about a week. I decided better of it and headed downstairs to leave. I got to the bottom of the stairs though, and as I walked across the hallway, I glanced to my right, looking through to the kitchen. Suddenly, something caught my eye. I took a step back and glared into the kitchen. Something was in there that I hadn't seen when I came into the house. I strained my eyes to work out what was it. At first, I thought it was a large, filled black bin bag, large and bulky, in the middle of the kitchen floor. Then something happened that literally terrified me, and it did, to be honest with you, it terrified me. Not the result of what I was seeing, but a strange and immense feeling of sheer dread came over me. At the same time, something that seemed to me to have been induced. Suddenly, what I thought was a large filled bin bag started to move. It was as if I wanted to run, but was terrified. I guess some type of psychological observer effect had come over me. Maybe a castback to long-lost survival sense to attempt to fully identify a threat before fleeing the location. I watched as the dark mass moved upwards in height and became large to a cowled figure. It was as if it had knelt on the kitchen floor, then slowly stood up without the aid of holding on to anything. It was really strange. The last I saw of it, it was fully standing up and was most certainly taller than I, around 7 feet in height, to be honest. I ran out the door, locked it, and was in my car and away. I don't even recall breathing when I ran out the house. Just don't remember. I was just panic. Get out of there. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't staying around to find out. In my years of research, I have on occasion encountered the darker side of the supernatural, yes. This time it felt different. Also, I was on my own, and possibly an easy target. I recall that strange feeling of dread staying with me for a mile or so, slowly fading away the more distance I put myself from that farmhouse. On October the 27th, I received a telephone call from Julie, who told me that they were selling the farm and had decided not to go back. I agreed it was likely a good idea after explaining to her what I had experienced, but at the same time reminding her that if they sold the property, the next family were likely to experience the same thing, and that I had concerns. The UK doesn't have any form of law stating that homeowners must declare such paranormal or supernatural occurrences in a home that they're selling. Occasionally, I think that's a shame, especially when it comes to people purchasing troubled properties. Julie informed me that Paul wasn't going to go back in the house. He had arranged to sell the farm as a fully furnished home. Julie asked me not to disclose information and photographs of the property, as they did not want to put anybody off from buying it. As the weeks passed, I often wondered how Paul and Julie went on. Did they manage to sell their home? And most of all, were the disturbances continuing? Now, in 1998, I once again visited North Wales on another investigation. This time, something different. Reports of strange lights seen in the sky over a small village. On my way back home, I realised I was only around 15 miles away from Paul and Julie's farmhouse. I travelled the small twisty back lanes until I came to the farm driveway. I pulled in and was shocked. There was nothing there. The whole place had been flattened, bulldozed, completely flat. What had gone on? A construction sign named the company responsible for the work being carried out there. The following day, I telephoned the company to ask a couple of questions. Turns out, the land had been sold and it was now undergoing construction for a factory outlet of units. They were not aware of who had owned the farmhouse, but they did tell me that when they arrived on site, the farmhouse was severely damaged due to fire. The front living room, the dining room, upstairs front bedrooms had all been gutted, ravaged by fire. Now, I'm not too sure as to the cause or what went on there after I'd left. I couldn't help thinking about the inexplicable fire, that happened whilst I was there, our paperwork. Could this have happened again? Wherever Paul, Julie and the two boys now reside, I hope they found a home that didn't already have an unwanted guest. Due to the farmhouse not being resold to another family, and as years passed, we decided to release some of this information. And the period of time when they actually burnt down the house may have been around Halloween. I was last there, prior to that, only about maybe a few days up to a week prior to Halloween of 1997. I don't know when it actually burnt down to the ground, but it is interesting that such paranormal activities or supernatural events do take place. And I do have a line, a limit that even I won't cross. When your body's screaming at you to say, get the hell out of there, it's important to listen to your body. And that's exactly what I did. And I scarpered. It was, I'll never forget it. It was pretty scary stuff. True, though, a real incident that did happen, which I don't think I'd want to experience again, to be honest. Not that type of nature anyway. I want to thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And most of all, have a wonderful Halloween.